Marketers must think in terms of the top line. I mean, people talk about the bottom line all the time. Our responsibility is to build the top line. And the more we focus on that, the revenue side, the better. So that we're not talking about cost efficiency so much as revenue maximisation. And profitable revenue maximisation is really what it's all about. And when I'm thinking about this, I say, oh yes, well now what is it we should look at if we're looking at the return on investment? The first point to start with is the question, well, how much do we spend in the first place? You know, what is the scale of this task and this responsibility that we have? And I've put together, these are Advertising Age figures, just generic international figures based on all the top multinationals around the world, to say, well, what is the sort of industry standard spending level on advertising broadly defined? So it would include broadcast and digital advertising. And you can see that the figures, this is as a percentage of sales on this first chart, that at the top end you have things like perfume and cosmetics where they spend, and the pharmaceutical industry spends about 20% of its sales revenue on its media, essentially, of one kind or another. The movie, video, kind of music industry spends nearly 20% also. The drinks industry spends about 15% of revenue, and I thought, well, I'll double check that, so I went and I had a look at Diageo, and Diageo spends more than that, it was 15.6, I think, so I was able to validate that generic statistic. And so on, the food industry, companies like Nestle and so on, spend about 11% there or thereabouts. Unilever, for example, is 12.6 last year, but you know, it's a very large, significant part of their revenue. And revenue is one thing, but if you look at profit, and this is just Advertising Age give you statistics on advertising as a percentage of gross profit. Net profit is a different thing, obviously, but even as a percent of gross profit, you can see that for things like the food industry and, say, the drinks industry, the kind of FMCG categories that we are used to dealing with, and that I think you are sort of assuming when you're talking about the various categories in the earlier presentations, I think the brand tracking and everything is nearly all FMCG. So in that FMCG category, which would be the soap and detergents category and the food category, and maybe we'd include the drink, you're talking about something like about 20% of gross profit. That's a fifth of gross profit. And if you go down to net profit, I haven't got a chart on it, but I did check it, for instance, for P&G. P&G worldwide spent $9.3 billion last year on their marketing. Net profit of the company was 10.6 billion. So their advertising spend was almost equal to their net profit, so closer to 100%. And Unilever last year spent 6.9 billion on advertising. How much was their net profit? 4.9. So their advertising spend was $1 billion more than the net profit of that major multinational. And what that leads me to think is it any wonder that the finance people, male or female, might be inclined to ask a few fairly serious questions about what are you guys doing? Lots of academics have done research on marketing in recession. And if you read all those articles, they'll say very worthy things about, you know, the brands that survived the recession best and came out of the recession strongest were the ones where people didn't cut the budgets. So what did all the companies do? All cut the budgets. In the final quarter of 2008, which was just after Lehman's collapsed, marketing budgets were cut by 15%, just in that final quarter in aggregate. And in 2009, they were cut by another big whack. And you see the curve go, I haven't got the curve for that, but it's too depressing. But every single company cut the advertising, which seems to suggest that, and I guess we sort of know it intuitively, that most finance people think of the marketing budget as the kind of cushion that they have, that when things start, if the profits for the end of the year start to look a bit shaky, what do you do to bolster them? You chop the marketing budget. And the trouble is that conveys an impression of lack of belief in the value of that spending. And we marketing people, I think, are guilty of this in some ways, that we have allowed ourselves to be seen as the fudge figure rather than a vital contributor.